What may we observe about the character of God then thus far, coming just up to the edge of the Isaac materials? We see God is one who makes covenants. He's done that already with Noah, hasn't he? And now a covenant made with Abraham, marked by circumcision. Initially, it was established through the call in chapter 12, and then reconfirmed in chapter 15, and then finally accompanied by a sign, an outward sign, the sign of circumcision. These insights concerning the significance that circumcision may have had for the people that day come from the Dictionary of the Old Testament, DOT abbreviated, the Pentateuch volume of that dictionary series issued by University Press. The article is written by Mr. Williamson. It's instructive to be aware that circumcision was not new with Israel. Other nations practiced it as well. It served as a sign of a promise made. Thinking of an analogy where we in modern culture, our culture, employ a sign to remind ourselves of a promise, a wedding ring serves that. It became then a means by which future generations could be included in covenant community membership, and even non-Israelites could become, we might think of them as naturalized citizens in a sense, but even more richly, participants in the covenant community. So it was not just for the first parties, for Abraham and for his immediate sons, but it was a means to make this covenant personal, individual, with ongoing generations. And it's very possible that we should understand the act of engagement of circumcision as an outward indication of inward submission to God, over against responding with rebellion against God. So it may signal a readiness to participate in God's plan and purpose. And you may say to yourself, well, how can an infant of 7 days old be ready to participate in God's plan and purpose? Well, admittedly, it's being done on his behalf by parents, but the overall participation of the nation in this, they were saying, by passing this custom on from one generation to the next, they may have been saying, we are committed to following God. He is the one who will be the director of the future of our nation. We see God then, back to theological observations, not only as one who initiates a covenant, but also sustains the covenant, even when the human parties to the covenant muddle things up, either by their own choices or by problems that they have no control over. So this is a summary of complications. Some of them Abraham and Sarah were responsible for, and some they had no control over. Let's read through them briefly. Sarai's initial barrenness. Sarai being included in Pharaoh's household. Abram's life being put at risk through the battle, trying to and effectively rescuing Lot. The question about Eliezer needing to become the heir since there was no son. The arrival of Ishmael into the family, an alternative heir. Sarah being taken into King Abimelech's family, and the near sacrifice of Isaac at Mount Moriah. It makes me think of Paul's writing to Timothy in his second letter with regard to those episodes when Abraham and or Sarai were responsible for muddling things up, making it difficult for God to keep the covenant. You recall that Paul writes, though we are faithless, he, God, remains faithful. He cannot deny himself, which might be a way of saying God, by his own character, must keep his promises. A beautiful affirmation of the faithfulness of God. Another element of theological observation, this little verse tucked away in chapter 15, verse 16, as God is promising the land of Israel to Abraham, this Canaan area, he explains why it won't happen right away, because the current inhabitants, the Amorites, haven't sinned enough yet. God knows that their trajectory is one where eventually he's going to have to pull the plug on that civilization, that society. But God needs to give them more time to prove that fact. And this in itself, is it not an act of mercy? How long will it take? About 400 years. You're probably aware of how pivotal in New Testament writings, particularly Galatians and Romans, is the episode in Genesis 15 where Abraham believed God, and we read that it was credited to him as righteousness. And so it may be worth exploring this a little more closely and asking about what was it? What was it that Abraham believed God for, leading to his description or the attribution of righteousness? Within that context, I trust you'll recall that the issue Abraham had difficulty believing was that God would make good on his promise to provide an heir. This is where he says, "Shall I make Eliezer my servant my heir?" In essence, adopt him to become the son that Sarah and I could not conceive. So what is it that Abraham was having trouble believing God? It was an heir. And then upon Abram responding and believing God for an heir, then God says, that's the stuff that righteousness is made of. When we come to Paul's writings in Galatians and Romans, then it's worth asking, was this the same kind of thing that Paul's looking for? Or he's indicating that faith will result in justification. We can affirm that indeed faith is made of the same substance, that is, trusting that God will do what he promised. But the promise at hand is somewhat different. For Abraham, it was believing the promise that an heir would be born. For Paul and for us, for humankind in being justified by faith, it is believing God's promise that he would provide a solution to our sin, a solution that we could not provide. So we cannot make ourselves righteous. God would have to bring someone on the scene who would bring about righteousness for us. We had to believe that he would do that and trust that when he says he will forgive on account of Jesus' sacrifice, he really will do that forgiving. So the action of faith is the same. The object of faith is different. Of course, God is the object of faith. In each case, we're trusting God. But what is the promise? The promise that was needing to be believed is a bit different in the two cases. This is not to say that Paul is misusing Abraham's example. It's just to look a little more closely and say, all right, there certainly is a strong example in Abram, but the actual application of it, Paul is adapting it and using it to encourage faith in a different promise, but a faith in the same faithful God. Since we're talking about this notion of righteousness, I'd like to introduce to you a connotation of righteousness for settings such as Genesis 15 that I have found immensely, immensely helpful. It comes from a textbook called Old Testament Survey. Old Testament Survey, abbreviated below as OTS, by Lasore, Hubbard, and Bush. And on page 49 of that textbook, they invite us to understand righteousness in the Old Testament setting as a little different than how it's typically portrayed in the teaching of the New Testament. That context has a different flavor. When first I came across this, it troubled me. I said, you're really confusing my notion of New Testament theology as a New Testament follower of the Messiah. And yet, as I've lived with this definition, it's grown on me, and I think there is a richness here, a dynamic component that is faithful to the culture and the usage in the Old Testament, one I commend to you. Let's read through it. Abraham's righteousness, then here we're thinking of Genesis 15, resided in his faith in God's gracious promise. The promise for an heir, right? And the writers continue, righteousness in the Bible is not a norm prescribing ethics, that is, do the right action, a list of things to be performed. But this righteousness in the Bible is faithfulness to a relationship, conducting oneself in a relationship as one promised to do. That's my interpolation now, completing the quote. The righteous person is loyal to the claims of all personal relationships. Let's bring that into the context of Genesis 15. The background of that, a promise from God to Abraham that if he will leave Ur the Chaldees and so forth, then God will raise up a great nation. As we reach Genesis 15, Abraham is doubting this. It hasn't happened yet. How long will he have to wait? Years and years and years. As God reassures him through that interchange, Abraham responds with faith. Now notice what that would involve here. That is saying, God, you've made this promise. I was inclined to give up on you, but after further thought and your reassurance, I'm not going to give up on you. I will remain loyal to the claims of this personal relationship. I will stay in it with you, because although you have not yet delivered, I believe you will deliver on this promise. I'm counting on you. I'm trusting you once again. I'm renewing my trust in you for that. So I, Abraham, will remain loyal to you. I will not abandon you, give up on you, and embrace some other God. I will remain loyal. The writers of Old Testament survey are saying that action is what righteousness, conducting in right relationship according to terms of loyalty, that's what righteousness is made of. It's not just, did Abraham complete the checklist of accurate sacrifices? Did he do this and not do that according to some code of behavior, some objective list? But rather, in his relationship with God, he hung in there. He remained loyal. And so now when we see God responding, crediting that to Abraham as righteousness, or regarding that as righteousness, we see the linkage between Abraham's loyalty, despite his earlier doubts, and the regarding it as righteousness as being a tighter linkage. It's like, oh, that's what righteousness is made of. And yes, sure enough, Abraham is behaving righteously, demonstrated by his loyalty. Now, someone might protest and say, well, what about the code of conduct that's expected for people who are claiming to be God's people? Does it mean the do's and don'ts have no matter? That there are no ethics in this? That's not what it means. But it means that the do's and don'ts are in the interest of a relationship. The do's and don'ts, that is the Ten Commandments, for example, the codes of conduct, they are not God. They are not the idol we worship. And I'm purposely putting it that way because sometimes rules can be elevated to an idol. But rather, those are specifics of which loyalty is comprised. We do that in order to have a relationship. You live that way in order to have a relationship. Think of a marriage. There's some things you agree to do and some things you agree not to do because you're married. Well, the not doing them, being, for example, you promise not to be unfaithful to your spouse. Well, that not being unfaithful, that's not the big objective of the marriage. The big objective is the marriage, to have the relationship. The code of conduct is a checklist, you might say, a checklist so that the relationship is strong. So loyalty to the claims of all personal relationships. That's the overarching goal, and that's what righteousness is about, and the code of conduct is in order to make that happen. Well, think about this. It may not work for you initially, but think on it, and I believe you will find this deeper understanding of righteousness in the Old Testament as being a very deepening, dynamic element instead of just an abstract list of behaviors. Continuing with theological observations, what about humankind? What do we learn about how people can and may behave? We find in Abraham someone capable of exerting or demonstrating faith, trust, and loyalty towards God, albeit not perfectly, and that in itself is quite a lesson to us. He didn't have to score 100% all the time to be the person that God wanted to do something amazing and earth-changing through. We're aware in this faithfulness of Abraham that even at the time of his death, many dimensions of the promises given to him he had not yet received. Was he great? Certainly he had a lot of wealth, as we might say a rancher, one individual, quite an estate. He still only has one remaining son, and we wouldn't describe him as yet becoming a nation. Is he a blessing to the world? Well, there have been some instances where that happened, but it certainly is not global yet. Does he own a lot of land? So far, nothing more than a burial plot. In fact, 4 centuries will elapse before his offspring move into this land. Nevertheless, we find a later description within the Pentateuch attributing to Abraham what's come to be called the Deuteronomic ideal, that is to say, the high description of honor that he earned. Let's take a look at that. On the left, you see a description of Abraham, and this incidentally was given to his son Isaac in chapter 26. On the right, we have this Deuteronomic ideal, how one is supposed to behave. Reading the left side, through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because, and here's a description of what Abraham achieved, Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. And now the ideal described later on through Moses' writing in Deuteronomy 11, love the Lord your God, keep his requirements, his decrees, his laws, and his commands always. It sounds like Moses is describing the ideal in terms of what Abraham achieved. He was that faithful in walking with God. To recap what God has achieved through the life of Abraham, a transition from a global focus that spans Genesis 1 to 11 and now zeroing in on a chosen family. We've seen a transition from the despair, remember that sense of shrill dissonance that Von Rad helped us see, dominating the Tower of Babel and dispersion. We've moved from that to the beginning of a global blessing, an immense dawning, a brightening on the deep darkness of the Tower of Babel, on the heels of that. And although Abram is not perfect, he is one who lives out courageous faithfulness to God, following his leadership and trusting in his promises.